Item Acquisition Fanfare, Isolation and Connection in Super Metroid. On the surface, Super Metroid is a game about being completely and utterly alone. There is one human character, galactic bounty hunter Samus Aran. She is us, and we are her. After the prologue, the player neither hears nor encounters another person. In the abstract, the goal is saving the galaxy, a seemingly empty world. Alone, all stimulation comes from the player's interactions with the environment. The setting is expansive and desolate. The landscape is littered with intertwining and confusing labyrinths. When above ground, the weather takes the nastiest form of gloom, and the acid rain continuously pours. This, quite obviously, is outwardly lonely. The game does its best to reinforce this loneliness, going out of its way to create a sense of dread. The gameplay is a balanced confluence of the mundane and the exotic, familiar enough to understand, but foreign enough to be unsettling. The setting, Planet Zebes, is dark and dreary. When it's colorful, the vibrance is muddied, doused in a pixelated black tinge. The soundtrack is equally haunting. The layered and compressed synths create a barren auditory landscape and heighten the feeling of isolation. There are no instructions given to the player, no maps telling them where to go. Instead, it is up to the player to explore and push through the feeling of total helplessness. Nevertheless, Super Metroid swells. The game's persistent dread, loneliness, and isolation are rhythmically broken up upon finding new items. While Metroid is awfully lonely, it is certainly not quiet. The game is brimming with alien creatures, their cacophonies presenting a discordant symphony. The game is loud. Upon entering an item room, however, the strident hum is quelled, and a feeling of accomplishment takes hold. A tune plays when an item is collected. It is a simple string of notes that has stuck with me. On the game's album, the melody is simply labeled Item Acquisition Fanfare. It's a strange title. Not that it's possible, but if it were possible, I feel like the phrase is drifting away. It's almost sarcastic in execution, a postmodern title that is aware of its purpose, but downplays any real excitement from the player. The wording is accurate but depressingly stoic, like the track is aware of a small but fleeting victory. To the title, the item is not an accomplishment, but simply fanfare, a foreshadowing of inevitable loneliness. The melody itself is simultaneously bright and melancholic. The notes ascend at first, creating a hopeful rise, but each one hangs a bit longer than expected, leaving a lingering right before moving on. Still, for me, a feeling of relief is ever present. There is genuine interplay. The game understands me and actively tries to hush the dreadful tone. The melody serves as a small moment of connection, a reminder that despite feeling isolated, I am not completely alone. The game's rhythm is purposeful, a calculated combination of ups and downs, enabling emotions to swell. See, while I may have felt alone, the ingenious game design guided me the way the developer intended. The design embraces a relaxed approach to interactive storytelling. Nevertheless, it presents a distinct optimal solution and a definite intended manner for the game to unfold. Some have coined this guidance Metroid's invisible hand. This premise is quite ingenious, especially for its time. Though the game offers an open world ripe for exploration, every barrier encounter is a subtle hint to change course. The player must catch these hints. The developers show, but they don't tell. Each new power-up allows access to previously unreachable areas, subtly nudging the player in the right direction. Hence, the player can believe they are traversing non-linearly, only to end on a predetermined path. In a way, the game cocoons the player in an illusion of independence. The invisible hand encourages exploration in the short term, allowing the player to invest and discover the game at their own pace. Super Metroid's approach to loneliness is unusual for 1994, especially from a company like Nintendo. Nintendo's titles were known for their bright colors and extensive cast of characters, games that did everything they could to draw the player in, to feel included. Super Metroid takes the opposite approach. It does everything it can to keep the player at bay, to isolate them and make them feel trapped in an alien setting. Nevertheless, it accomplishes the same thing as its bright predecessors, albeit in a way that is less about emotional accessibility and broad challenge, and more about emotional investment and intellectual engagement. See, there were certain points in Super Metroid when I needed a reward, when I was ready to break from my feeling of restlessness. Every time, without fail, the game seemed to respond, giving me a checkpoint or an item followed by melodic fanfare and relief. The phenomenon is a lot like clicking with someone in real life, the feeling that a person understands you both intellectually and instinctually, the understanding that your exchange of ideas and insight is mutually beneficial. It's that which is ironic about Super Metroid. In an environment that is tailor-made to be isolating and lonely, the feeling of connection trumps all. Nevertheless, I often question this phenomenon. How can this world be so dissonant? Sometimes I'll ask in astonishment and curiosity, sometimes in bewilderment or vexation, other times in projected fear. How can this world be so captivating, so awe-inspiring, so rewarding, so pure, so terrifying, so alien, yet so achingly human? A year before Super Metroid, 1993 saw a series of Senate hearings on video game violence. It was a satanic panic of sorts. Politicians voiced concern over violent titles like Mortal Kombat and Night Trap corrupting America's youth. Before release, Super Metroid faced similar criticism. Developers responded by claiming the game was not being violent for the sake of violence. When put into context, the political climate clearly disincentivized Super Metroid's complex vision and incentivized a docile and vanilla experience. Regardless, the development team made their own game in their own way. They introduced a new style of player-centric gaming, prioritizing the player's intellect and emotional state in a unique and solitary environment. Contrary to popular beliefs at this time, this lonely atmosphere deepened player engagement and commitment, promoting cognitive and emotional agility instead of mindless violence. They didn't have to make Super Metroid open world. They didn't have to let the player feel free. They didn't have to make a nuanced platformer. And they didn't have to change the formula. Nevertheless, they did. Perhaps that's the true mark of genius and artistry, burning your laurels. There's a forum post by a user who goes by the well-read image, all lowercase. I stumbled upon the post while doing background research for this essay. The author interprets Super Metroid through the lens of motherhood, exclaiming how the game works as an allegory for postpartum depression. In his post, he shares an intimate reflection on what it's like to become a father and watching his partner go through the rigors of new motherhood. Quote, the combination of exhaustion, sleep deprivation, postpartum depression, a sense of awesome and unavoidable responsibility, my son's own inability to eat properly shortly after birth, and a blend of new and potent emotions weren't necessarily things which caught us off guard, so much as they proved to be more than we could physically and mentally handle. The author and his wife found solace in Super Metroid. More specifically, it helped the author understand his wife's internal experience, allowing him to recognize and empathize with her. In the loneliness of Samus, he saw his wife, and she saw herself. Like any great work of art, Metroid has a way of molding to you, becoming something far greater than what it seems. In comforting and overcoming the game's itching solitude and obstacles, the player can grow and evolve, not just in the context of the game, but on an emotional level, too. There's a caveat to all this. When it's all said and done, the game fades to black, and the connection washes away. The player is left in a room, no less alone than they were before. The illusion of interplay, not interplay, allows the player to be seen and understood. The game is designed to create a specific emotional landscape, but is ultimately up to our own interpretations that give us the feeling of depth and significance. The developers are not in the room with us. They're not understanding our every move and emotion. But through the experience they've crafted, they've created a connection, however fleeting, for a brief moment in time. I ask you, is this feeling, however real it may seem to us, a genuine form of connection? If your answer to this question is no, would you say the same thing about a great book or painting? Is a religious experience with a novel an inherently narcissistic phenomenon? Is your feeling of connection through the book actually just a connection with yourself? Moreover, if the experience is not a real connection because it is fleeting, couldn't you say the same thing about most interpersonal relationships? Is it not true that when it's all said and done, in a club, workplace, and classroom, everybody else leaves, and you are equally as alone as before? Conversely, if your answer to this question is yes, and all forms of connection are valid, would you say the same thing about consumer culture? Does feeling a kinship with a brand or a product, or a sense of belonging with a fan base also count as real and significant? Is it a form of connection? Is there a line to be drawn, and if so, where? Follow-up question, does a connection have to be genuine? In other words, does it matter how I receive my feeling of connection? Is a connection between a company and a consumer aimed at making money considered genuine if the consumer perceives it that way? I may be looking at this the wrong way. The underlying logic of these questions may be flawed. If the sentiment is true, though, that all feelings of connection equal real, genuine connection, or at the very least are valued in the same way, then why do I need other people? Is it to validate my existence? To take pride in my achievements? I want to say yes to my original question, but if it were really true, then I should want a real-world invisible hand, an autonomous, self-regulating, and selfishly driven ecosystem only dedicated to what and how much I want to feel that day. To me, that feels completely and utterly, soul-crushingly lonely. Regardless, I know we're not narcissists. I don't think you are, and I hope I'm not either.